The day a South African nanny saved his son's life is the day Korea's most powerful mafia boss began to die. He just didn't know it yet. Kangpai didn't believe in coincidences. In his world, every meeting was orchestrated, every relationship transactional, every smile calculated. So when the 17th nanny candidate walked into his Seoul mansion without trembling, he should have known something was wrong. The previous 16 had all failed the same test. They'd entered through the mahogany doors, seen the armed guards flanking the entrance, noticed the way servants averted their eyes when Kangpai passed, and understood exactly what kind of household this was. One woman had actually crossed herself. Another had excused herself to the bathroom and climbed out the window. His head of security had found her running down the driveway in heels, clutching her purse like it contained salvation. Kangpai had found it almost amusing. Almost. But Zara walked in like she was entering a garden party. Her application said she was 28, from Cape Town, with credentials from 3 diplomatic families in South Africa. What it didn't say was that she moved like water, that her smile could make a man forget he'd ordered 2 executions before breakfast, or that when she laughed at something his head of staff said. The sound filled spaces in Kangpai's mansion that had been hollow since Helen died. "Mr. Lee," she said, extending her hand instead of bowing. American informality with a melodic accent that turned his Korean name into music. "Thank you for seeing me." He stared at her hand for 3 full seconds. His lieutenants shifted uncomfortably. No one touched Kangpai uninvited. It simply wasn't done. But she held his gaze with those impossibly warm eyes, waiting, patient, like she had all the time in the world and no fear to spare. He shook her hand. Her grip was firm, confident. Her skin was soft. "You understand what this position requires?" he asked, releasing her hand before his own gave away how long it had been since he'd touched someone who wasn't trying to kill him or begging for mercy. A 5-year-old boy who's lost his mother needs consistency, patience, and love, Zara replied simply. The rest is just logistics. Love. She'd said it like it was the easiest thing in the world. Like it didn't cost everything. Like it wasn't the weakness that had gotten Helen killed and turned Kangpai's heart to permafrost. "My son doesn't speak," Kangpai said, watching for her reaction. "Testing. Hasn't said a word since his mother died. Doctors call it selective mutism. Trauma response." "Then I'll speak enough for both of us until he's ready," Zara said without hesitation. "Children heal when they feel safe. My job is to make him feel safe." Something in Kangpai's chest shifted. Something dangerous. He should have ended the interview right there. Should have had her escorted out before that warmth in her voice infected the cold, controlled environment he'd built to keep his son protected from the truth of what his father really was. Instead, he heard himself say, "When can you start?" "Tomorrow," she answered, smiling like she'd just won something. She had. She'd won entry into the one place Kangpai swore no one would ever breach again, the carefully constructed walls around his fractured family. In the corner of the room, his most trusted lieutenant caught his eye. The man's expression was carefully neutral, but Kangpai had known him for 15 years. He could read the warning there as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud. Kangpai ignored it. For the first time in 5 years, he ignored his instincts, his training, his rules. Because Zara had used the word love like it was possible, and some desperate, broken part of him wanted to believe her. That was his first mistake. The crack had begun. Kangpai's phone buzzed during the back 9 at the Bluestone Country Club in Austin, Texas. He was standing over a 12-foot putt that would determine whether Senator Mitchell's construction contracts went to the Korean syndicate or stayed with the Italian families who'd controlled Dallas for 3 decades. The senator himself stood 20 feet away, sweating through his polo shirt despite the mild November weather. Kangpai checked the message without breaking his stance. A single photograph, a warehouse in Busan, still smoking. 3 bodies arranged in a very specific pattern. The message was clear: the Cheongju faction had rejected his terms. Again. He sank the putt without looking up. "Stroke of luck," Senator Mitchell said weakly, his laugh not quite reaching his eyes. "I don't believe in luck, Senator." Kangpai handed his putter to his caddy and turned to face the man directly. "I believe in understanding what motivates people. You, for instance, are motivated by your daughter's medical school tuition at Johns Hopkins. Expensive program. But my people tell me there's a very generous scholarship available for children of cooperative public servants. The senator's face went pale, then red, then settled into resigned acceptance. King Pai had seen the progression 1,000 times. It was almost boring now. The contracts will be reassigned by Friday, Mitchell said quietly. Wednesday, King Pai corrected, already walking toward the clubhouse. And Senator? Your daughter is very talented. It would be a shame if anything disrupted her studies. It wasn't a threat. Not technically. But both men understood perfectly. The private jet was waiting at Austin Bergstrom, engines already running. King Pai boarded without acknowledging the pilot or the 2 bodyguards who'd materialized from the terminal. 12 hours to Seoul. He had 3 conference calls scheduled, 2 contracts to review, and 1 problem in Busan that required a very personal solution. He opened his laptop, checked futures markets in Tokyo, real estate developments in Vancouver, shipping manifests for the container operation in Long Beach. His empire sprawled across continents like a living organism, and King Pai was its brain, calculating, controlling, constantly aware of every cell. His phone buzzed again. Another photo. The Cheongju faction's second-in-command, bound to a chair in a location King Pai recognized. One of his own warehouses. His sole lieutenant had worked fast. He typed a single word in response, wait. The man could sit there and think about his choices for a while. Fear was more effective than pain. King Pai had learned that lesson watching his own father extract information from rivals when he was barely 12 years old. Terror was an art form, and King Pai had inherited the family talent. The flight attendant approached with practiced deference. Sir, would you like? No. He didn't look up. She disappeared instantly. Good. He'd trained his staff well. The key to maintaining power wasn't cruelty, it was consistency. People needed to know exactly what to expect from you. King Pai was always the same, cold, controlled, and absolutely certain. Somewhere over the Pacific, he stood to stretch and caught his reflection in the cabin window. 48 years old. Not a gray hair out of place. The dragon tattoo that crawled up his neck from beneath his collar was still sharp, still vibrant. He maintained his body the way he maintained his empire, with discipline and precision. Tennis twice a week. Golf for business. A strict diet monitored by a private nutritionist. Everything controlled. Everything calculated. He should have felt satisfied. The senator had folded. The Busan problem would be resolved within hours. His holdings had increased by 17% this quarter. He'd attended a technology conference in Seoul last month where CEOs and politicians had vied for 30 seconds of his attention. Instead, he felt nothing. The reflection staring back at him could have been carved from ice. Same expression he'd worn at Helen's funeral 5 years ago. Same expression he'd worn when the doctor placed his newborn son in his arms and explained that his wife hadn't survived the emergency cesarean. Same expression he'd worn 2 weeks later when he'd personally hunted down every person connected to the attack that had killed her. Grief was a luxury King Pai couldn't afford. So he'd simply turned it off. Like flipping a switch. And everything else had gone dark with it. His phone buzzed. A reminder from his assistant. Interview nanny candidates tomorrow, 2 p.m. He'd been avoiding it for 3 months. His son's previous nanny had quit after witnessing a business meeting that had gotten louder and more violent than King Pai had intended. The boy had been cycling through temporary help ever since, and according to the child psychologist, the instability was making things worse. Not that Ji-hoon spoke enough to complain. King Pai deleted the reminder, then immediately reset it. He could negotiate billion-dollar deals without hesitation, but the thought of sitting across from strangers who would judge his ability to parent made something twist uncomfortably in his chest. Helen would have handled this. Helen had handled everything soft and human and good. She'd been the translator between King Pai's cold world and their son's need for warmth. Without her, there was just emptiness. The jet began its descent into Seoul. Below, the city sprawled like a circuit board, millions of lives intersecting and connecting. Somewhere down there, his son was sleeping in a mansion that felt more like a mausoleum. surrounded by guards and staff and every material comfort imaginable. Completely alone. Just like his father. Ji-hoon was building a tower when Kang-pai came home at 3 in the morning. The boy sat cross-legged in the center of his bedroom floor, surrounded by blocks in precise geometric patterns that looked less like child's play and more like architectural blueprints. He didn't look up when his father entered. Didn't acknowledge the sound of expensive Italian leather shoes on hardwood, or the way Kang-pai's shadow fell across his careful construction. 5 years old and already fluent in the language of pretending people didn't exist. Ji-hoon, Kang-pai said softly, using the affectionate suffix that felt foreign in his mouth. He spoke Korean at home, one of the few traditions he'd maintained from his own childhood. It's very late. The boy's hands continued their work. Red block on blue block. Yellow balanced on top. His small fingers moved with the same precision Kang-pai used when field stripping a weapon. Deliberate. Controlled. Utterly focused on something that couldn't hurt him. Kang-pai crouched down, his knees protesting the movement. When had he gotten old? What are you building? Nothing. Not even a flicker of recognition. Ji-hoon reached for a green block, examined it from 3 angles, then set it aside in favor of another red one. His face held the same neutral expression Kang-pai had seen in his own reflection hours earlier. It was like looking at a miniature version of himself, and the sight made something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't normal. 5-year-olds were supposed to be loud, messy, demanding. They were supposed to ask endless questions and laugh at things that weren't funny and cry over skin knees. Kang-pai's childhood had been unusual, violent, controlled, preparing him for the life he'd inherit, but even he remembered being something. Feeling something. His son felt nothing. Or had learned to show nothing. Kang-pai wasn't sure which possibility was worse. The new nanny starts tomorrow, he said, still crouching, still trying. She's from South Africa. You'll like her. Ji-hoon's tower collapsed. 1 block had been placed at a fractionally wrong angle, and the entire structure came down in a quiet cascade. Most children would have cried, or shouted in frustration, or immediately begun rebuilding with renewed determination. Ji-hoon simply stared at the ruins. His face didn't change. His breathing didn't quicken. He just observed the destruction like it was happening to someone else. Then, methodically, he began picking up the blocks one by one and placing them back in their storage container. Cleaning up. Erasing the evidence of his effort. Starting over with nothing. Kang-pai stood abruptly, his chest tight. You need to sleep. The boy didn't respond. Just continued his careful cleanup, each block finding its designated slot. Organized. Controlled. Empty. Kang-pai left the room before he did something unforgivable like let his son see the fear in his eyes. He walked down the hall to what used to be the master bedroom. He'd moved to a different wing after Helen died, couldn't stand sleeping in a bed that still smelled like her perfume, that still had her jewelry on the nightstand, her books stacked on the side table. But he'd kept her room exactly as it was. A shrine to a life he'd destroyed through proximity. He stood in the doorway now, not entering, never entering. Just looking at the space where a woman had once laughed at his terrible jokes and rolled her eyes when he took business calls during dinner. Helen, who'd been a nurse at the private hospital where Kang-pai had his bullet wound treated after a territorial dispute went wrong. Who'd seen him at his most vulnerable, bleeding, cursing in 3 languages, absolutely furious at the incompetence that had allowed someone to get that close and had still smiled at him like he was human. You're a terrible patient, she'd said, her Canadian accent making the words sound gentle even as she jabbed the 4 into his arm with more force than strictly necessary. You're a sadist, he'd replied. Lucky for you, I like a challenge. 6 months later, he'd married her. His father had been furious, a Canadian nurse with no family connections, no useful alliances, nothing to offer the organization except herself. But Kang-pai had been 28 and stupid enough to believe love could exist separate from the violence that funded it. He'd been wrong. Love didn't exist separately from anything. It made you visible. Made you vulnerable. Made you leave your pregnant wife at home while you flew to Singapore because a shipment needed your personal attention, and that's when they struck. That's when his enemies realized the easiest way to hurt the untouchable King Pai wasn't to attack him directly, it was to attack the soft, undefended parts of his life he'd been arrogant enough to create. Helen had called him while she was bleeding out. The security team had played him the recording afterward. Her voice, broken and scared, telling him she loved him. Telling him to name their son Ji-hoon if she didn't make it. Telling him it wasn't his fault. Lying, even at the end. It was absolutely his fault. He'd brought her into his world and expected the violence to respect boundaries. Expected his enemies to have honor. Expected love to be enough protection. The doctors had saved the baby. Barely. Ji-hoon had been born 8 weeks early, tiny and silent, his first breath drawn in a delivery room that smelled like his mother's blood. And he'd been silent ever since. No crying as an infant. No babbling as a toddler. No first words to celebrate or record in baby books. Just silence. Like he'd understood from birth that sound drew attention, and attention meant danger. The child psychologist King Pai hired the fourth one, after the first 3 had proven useless, said Ji-hoon's mutism was trauma response. That children could absorb stress in utero, that Helen's terror in her final moments might have imprinted on the baby's developing brain. That with time, patience, and the right environment, the boy might speak. Might. King Pai had paid the woman 3 times her normal fee and never called her again. He didn't want maybes and theories. He wanted solutions. But there was no solution to this. No amount of money or power or violence could undo what he'd already done. He closed Helen's door and walked back to Ji-hoon's room. The boy was in bed now, covers pulled up to his chin, eyes open and staring at the ceiling. The blocks were all put away. The room was spotless. "Good night, Adol," King Pai said. "Son." The word felt too large for his mouth. Ji-hoon blinked once. Twice. Then closed his eyes. Not acknowledgement. Just coincidence. King Pai stood there for 5 full minutes, watching his child breathe, looking for some sign of the person his son might have been if his father had been anyone else. If his mother had married a doctor or a teacher or literally anyone who didn't fund their lifestyle with blood money and territorial expansion. But all he saw was a small, silent ghost of a boy who'd learned the most important lesson too early. In this house, in this life, showing weakness meant losing everything. Just like his father had learned. Just like his father was teaching him, whether he meant to or not. King Pai left the room and went to his study. He had calls to make about the Busan situation. Decisions to finalize about the senator's contracts. An empire to run that didn't stop spinning just because a man was drowning in guilt at 3 in the morning. But first, he poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey, Macallan 25, because even his vices were precisely calibrated, and stood at the window overlooking Seoul. Somewhere in this city, a South African nanny was sleeping peacefully, probably dreaming about her new job taking care of a wealthy businessman's quiet son. Probably thinking it would be easy money. A sad child who needed love, and she had love to give. She had no idea she was walking into a mausoleum. That the boy she'd be caring for was already half-ghost. That his father was the rest of the way there, just better at hiding it. King Pai finished the whiskey in 1 swallow. Tomorrow, she'd arrive. Tomorrow, she'd meet Ji-hoon and probably realize within hours that this job was impossible. Tomorrow, she'd be candidate number 18 in a long line of people who tried and failed to reach a child who'd decided silence was safer than speaking. Tomorrow, everything would continue exactly as it had been. Except it wouldn't. Because tomorrow, Zara would walk into his house with her impossible warmth and her fearless smile, and the careful emptiness King Pai had built to protect what remained of his family would begin to crack. He just didn't know it yet. Zara arrived at exactly 9 in the morning with a single suitcase, a worn leather backpack, and a smile that seemed physically incompatible with the armed guards flanking King Pai's front entrance. "Beautiful house," she said to the head of security, a man named Daejung who hadn't smiled since 1997. "These gardens must take a lot of work." Daejung blinked at her like she'd just spoken Martian. People didn't compliment the landscaping. People didn't make small talk with the security team. People, generally, tried to minimize interaction with anyone who looked like they knew 17 ways to kill you with a fountain pen. The grounds crew maintains them, he said stiffly, scanning her bag with practiced efficiency. Well, they're doing a wonderful job. These azaleas are spectacular. Zara leaned closer to examine a bush near the entrance, genuinely delighted. We had these in Cape Town, but never this color. What's the soil pH here? Kangpai watched the exchange from his study window on the second floor. He'd been watching since her taxi pulled up to the gate 15 minutes ago. Watched her pay the driver with a generous tip that made the man's face light up. Watched her pause at the entrance to take in the full scope of the mansion with an expression that wasn't intimidation or calculation, but simple appreciation. Like she was visiting a museum, not entering the home of one of Asia's most dangerous men. Now she was discussing horticulture with his head of security, who looked like he was actively questioning his life choices. Mrs. Choi, the head of household staff, appeared in the doorway to collect their new arrival. 63 years old, 4 feet 11 inches of compressed disapproval, the woman had worked for Kangpai's family since before he was born. She'd seen 3 generations of violence, buried 2 of her own sons who'd worked in the organization, and maintained an expression of permanent skepticism toward anything that hadn't been personally vetted by her for at least a decade. She looked Zara up and down with the warmth of a tax auditor. "You're the new nanny." "I am." Zara extended her hand. "Zara Okonkwo." "It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Choi." The older woman ignored the offered hand. "Your room is in the East Wing. You'll maintain the child's schedule, prepare his meals, supervise his activities, and ensure he's in bed by 8. You do not enter Mr. Lee's private quarters. You do not discuss household business with outsiders. You do not." "Love what you've done with the foyer," Zara interrupted gently, looking up at the vaulted ceiling where a crystal chandelier caught the morning light. "Is that Italian marble?" Mrs. Choi's left eye twitched. "Carrara marble. Imported in 1994 by Mr. Lee's father. Exquisite choice. The veining is remarkable." Zara set down her suitcase and walked to the center of the foyer, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She turned slowly, taking in the sweeping staircase, the art pieces that cost more than most people's houses, the careful architecture designed to impress and intimidate. This is a home that demands respect. "It is a home that demands obedience," Mrs. Choi corrected. "Those aren't quite the same thing, are they?" Zara's smile didn't falter. "But I understand. Where's Jihoon?" The casual use of the child's name, no honorific, no formal distance, made Mrs. Choi's other eye twitch. Upstairs, Kangpai found himself leaning closer to the window, straining to hear. "The young master is in the playroom," Mrs. Choi said icily. "He does not like to be disturbed. Children often don't like things that are good for them. That's why they need us." Zara picked up her suitcase again. "Shall we? I'd love to meet him. Your room first. You'll unpack, change into appropriate attire, and..." "I'm appropriate now." Zara glanced down at her simple jeans and white blouse. Clean, comfortable, nothing restrictive. Perfect for playing with a 5-year-old. "The unpacking can wait." "He can't." She started toward the stairs without waiting for permission. Mrs. Choi made a sound somewhere between a cough and a strangled gasp. No one walked away from Mrs. Choi mid-conversation. It simply wasn't done. "The playroom is on the 3rd floor, west corridor," she called after Zara, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Thank you." Zara's voice floated back, warm and unbothered. "I'll find it." Kangpai moved from the study to the hallway, tracking her progress. He told himself it was security protocol, evaluating a new employee, ensuring she didn't access restricted areas. But really, he was curious. 17 candidates had wilted under Mrs. Choi's initial inspection. This woman had just smiled at her and kept walking. Either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. He reached the 3rd floor just as Zara found the playroom. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, not entering, just observing. Jihoon sat in the center of the room exactly as he had at 3 in the morning, building a tower with those same geometric blocks, his face blank with concentration. "Hello, Jihoon," Zara said softly. Not too loud, not too cheerful. Just Present. My name is Zara. I'm going to be spending time with you. The boy didn't look up. Didn't pause in his construction. Another block added to the tower. Precise placement. No acknowledgement that he'd heard her at all. That's a beautiful tower you're building, Zara continued, leaning against the doorframe. Still not entering. Respecting his space. I used to build things too, when I was your age. Buildings mostly. My father was an architect. Well, he said he was an architect. Really, he just liked drawing buildings he'd never actually construct. Ji-hoon reached for a blue block. His hand hesitated for half a second, barely noticeable. Then continued. Zara noticed. My father told me that the most important part of any building isn't the foundation, even though that's what everyone says. It's the empty spaces. The windows. The doorways. The places where light gets in. She paused. I think he meant buildings. But maybe he meant people too. The boy's hands stilled completely. He didn't look at her. Didn't acknowledge her. But he'd stopped building. Kangpai held his breath. I'm going to sit right here, Zara said, lowering herself to the floor just outside the playroom threshold. Not in your space. Just nearby. And when you're ready, if you're ready, you can show me what you're building. Or not. Both are okay. She settled onto the hardwood floor like it was the most natural thing in the world, crossing her legs, resting her hands in her lap. Patient. Calm. Making herself smaller, less threatening. Ji-hoon placed one more block. Then another. The tower grew slowly, methodically. 5 minutes passed. 10. Zara didn't speak again. Didn't check her phone or show any sign of impatience. Just sat there, breathing quietly, occasionally tilting her head to observe his progress from a different angle. 15 minutes in, Ji-hoon picked up a red block and held it out toward her. Not making eye contact. Not speaking. Just offering. Zara's face transformed. Not into exaggerated excitement that might scare him, but into genuine pleasure. For me? Thank you, Ji-hoon. That's very kind. She took the block carefully, like it was made of crystal instead of wood. Examined it with the same intensity he'd shown. This is a good one. Strong color. Good weight. Where should it go? Ji-hoon pointed at a gap in the tower's base. A specific spot that needed reinforcement. Zara stood slowly, walked into the playroom with careful steps, and placed the block exactly where he'd indicated. Like this. The boy studied her work. Then, so quick Kangpai almost missed it, nodded. One tiny movement of his head. The first deliberate communication Ji-hoon had made with another person in 3 months. Zara smiled and returned to her spot in the doorway. I'll be right here if you need another assistant. She sat back down. Ji-hoon returned to building. And in the hallway, hidden in shadow, Kangpai felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with business or empire or carefully calculated risk. This woman had accomplished in 15 minutes what 4 child psychologists and 16 nannies had failed to do in 5 years. She'd reached his son. Not through expertise or credentials or therapeutic techniques, but through simple, patient humanity. She was dangerous. Not in the way his enemies were dangerous. They threatened his power, his territory, his life. She was dangerous because she threatened something far more protected. The careful distance he'd placed between himself and the possibility of caring about anyone ever again. He should fire her immediately. Thank her for her time, pay her for the full month, and find someone less perceptive, less warm, less capable of making his silent son nod. Instead, Kangpai found himself turning away, returning to his study, already planning to be home for dinner tonight instead of working late. Already wondering what other small miracles this woman might produce. Already making his second fatal mistake. The first had been hiring her. The second was wanting her to stay. Zara arrived at 7 in the morning with a duffel bag, a smile that could melt permafrost, and absolutely no concept of appropriate boundaries. She walked past Kangpai's head of security like he was holding a door instead of a loaded weapon. Breezed through the marble foyer without gawking at the original Monet or the custom chandelier that cost more than most people's houses. Just followed the housekeeper to the nursery wing with the kind of relaxed confidence that suggested she either had no survival instincts or nerves made of titanium. Kangpai watched her from his study via the security cameras. He'd been up all night finalizing the Busan contracts, but exhaustion evaporated the moment she knocked on Ji-hoon's door and entered without waiting for a response that would never come. The boy was already awake, sitting at his small desk with a coloring book open in front of him. He wasn't coloring, just staring at the page with that same hollow expression that made Kangpai's chest ache. "More, my scat," Zara said, her Afrikaans endearment rolling off her tongue like music. She crouched down to Ji-hoon's eye level without touching him, respecting his space in a way the other 17 nannies never had. "I'm Zara. I'm going to be spending time with you." Ji-hoon didn't look at her. His small hand picked up a red crayon, examined it, set it down. Picked up blue. Examined. Set down. Zara watched him for a full minute. Not trying to force interaction. Not filling the silence with nervous chatter. Just observing with those impossibly warm eyes like she could see straight through to whatever was locked inside his carefully constructed walls. Then she did something that made Kangpai lean closer to the monitor. She started coloring in her own corner of the page. Humming that same Afrikaans lullaby from the hook, her voice soft and unself-conscious. Not performing. Just being. Ji-hoon's hand hesitated over the green crayon. It was subtle, the kind of micro-reaction Kangpai had learned to watch for after 5 years of near misses. A fraction of a second where the boy's robotic precision faltered. Where something almost like curiosity flickered behind those dark eyes that looked too much like his father's. Zara kept humming. Kept coloring. A terrible rendition of what might have been a flower or possibly an alien spacecraft. Her tongue poked out slightly in concentration, and Kangpai found himself transfixed by the unself-conscious joy in her movements. When had he last seen someone experience joy? Ji-hoon picked up the green crayon. His hand moved toward the page, not his usual geometric precision, but something messier. More childlike. He colored 3 wobbly strokes before stopping, his body going rigid like he'd committed some unforgivable crime. Zara glanced at his addition to the page. "Beautiful," she said simply. Not praising excessively. Not making a big deal. Just acknowledging. Then she went back to her terrible flower alien. Kangpai watched his son's shoulders gradually relax. Watched him add another stroke. Then another. It wasn't speaking. It wasn't even close to normal interaction. But it was something. And for the first time in 5 years, Kangpai allowed himself the dangerous luxury of hope. Kangpai noticed the inconsistencies on a Tuesday. He was reviewing background checks in his study, routine security sweeps he ran on everyone in his household every 6 months, when Minjun, his head of intelligence, placed a thin folder on his desk with the kind of careful neutrality that meant trouble. "The nanny," Minjun said. No inflection. Just facts. There are gaps. Kangpai didn't open the folder immediately. Downstairs, he could hear Zara laughing, actual laughter, the kind that echoed through his mausoleum of a house like it had forgotten what joy sounded like. She'd been with them for 6 weeks now, and Ji-hoon had started eating breakfast without being prompted. Small victory. Impossible victory. What kind of gaps? His voice was flat. Professional. The same tone he used when discussing shipments and territorial disputes. Her employment history in Johannesburg. 3 years unaccounted for between her nursing degree and moving to Seoul. The references check out, but they're surface level. No depth. Minjun hesitated, which he never did. The passport has correct stamps, but the photo quality is inconsistent with standard South African issue from that period. Kangpai opened the folder. Scanned the report with eyes that had spent 30 years identifying lies in paperwork. The red flags were there, subtle. Easily missed if you weren't looking, but present. A reference who answered questions too smoothly. An address in Cape Town that existed, but had no rental records attached to her name. A university transcript with the right registrar signature, but slightly wrong font weight. Good forgeries. Expensive forgeries. The kind that suggested professional help. From downstairs, Ji-hoon, should we make the dinosaur blue or green? Show me with your finger. A pause. Then Zara's delighted gasp. Green. Excellent choice, my scat. You have your Yama's good taste. She'd said mother again. About Helen. Like she'd earned the right to invoke a dead woman's memory. And the truly unforgivable part was that Ji-hoon had made a choice, had engaged in a way he never did with anyone else. Kangpai closed the folder. "Keep monitoring," he said. "But don't approach her. Not yet." Minjun's expression didn't change, but his silence spoke volumes. In their world, inconsistencies meant danger. Forged documents meant infiltration. Unknown gaps meant someone was hiding something worth killing over. The protocol was clear: investigate, isolate, eliminate if necessary. But Kangpai was thinking about how Zara had convinced Ji-hoon to try soup last week. How his son had actually opened his mouth and swallowed without the mechanical obedience that characterized every other meal. How she'd clapped her hands with such genuine pride that even Kangpai had felt something warm and dangerous bloom in his chest. "She could be a plant," Minjun said quietly. "The Russians have been expanding into Gangnam. The Chinese are still angry about the Busan situation. Even the Americans." I said keep monitoring. Kangpai's tone left no room for argument. "That's an order." Minjun bowed slightly and left. The folder remained on the desk like an accusation. Kangpai should have been reviewing it. Should have been making calls, running deeper background checks, having Zara followed to whatever she did on her days off. Should have been doing what kept him alive for 48 years in a business where trust was currency and suspicion was survival. Instead, he found himself walking downstairs to the playroom where Zara sat cross-legged on the floor, a green crayon in her hand and his son's small body actually leaning, against her side while they colored together. She looked up when he entered, and her smile was so genuine it made his teeth ache. "Look," she said, holding up the paper. Ji-hoon made a whole family of dinosaurs. The drawing was messy, childish, utterly normal. His son's first real artwork in 5 years. Kangpai looked at the picture. At his son's almost relaxed posture. At Zara's warm eyes that held no calculation he could detect. "Beautiful," he said. And ignored the folder burning a hole through his conscience 3 floors above. The warning came in the form of a severed finger delivered to Kangpai's downtown office in a Tiffany box. Classy. The Chinese always had a flair for ironic packaging. His lieutenant Sung-min stood across the desk, jaw tight, while Kangpai examined the contents with clinical detachment. The finger belonged to one of his mid-level operators in Itaewon, a man who handled cash flows from 3 nightclubs and knew better than to get caught. The nail was painted red. A woman's shade. Mockery wrapped in brutality. "They took him outside the boys' school," Sung-min said. "Broad daylight. Made sure our people saw. Ji-hoon's school. Not just any target. A message written in blood and proximity." Kangpai set the box down carefully, his expression unchanged. Inside, something cold and familiar clicked into place, the part of him that had survived 16 assassination attempts by being 3 steps ahead and twice as vicious as anyone expected. Which faction? Chen's people out of Busan. But the timing. Sung-min hesitated. They've been quiet for 8 months. This is coordinated. Someone told them now was the right time to push. Now. 6 weeks after Zara arrived. 6 weeks after Kangpai started leaving the office early to have dinner with his son. 6 weeks after he'd been caught smiling at his head of security when Zara had texted him a photo of Ji-hoon wearing a dinosaur costume she'd made from cardboard boxes. Weakness detected. Blood in the water. Sharks circling. "Double the security detail on the house," Kangpai said. "Rotate the school pickup routes daily. No patterns. And find out who in Chen's organization has been chatty. I want names by midnight." Sung-min nodded and left. The Tiffany box remained. Kangpai's phone buzzed. A message from Zara. Ji-hoon ate all his vegetables today. Even the broccoli. Should we celebrate with ice cream? Soft ice cream. An emoji. She'd sent him an emoji. Like he was a normal father instead of a man currently planning how to systematically dismantle a Chinese triad cell without starting a full-scale war. He typed back, "Get him whatever he wants." 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. What he wants is for you to come home for dinner. We're making bibimbap. Well, I'm making it. Ji-hoon is supervising very seriously. Home for dinner. Like that was possible. Like he could sit at a table and pretend normalcy while his enemies were literally taking fingers and testing boundaries. Like spending time with his family wouldn't paint an even larger target on their backs. His family. When had he started thinking of Zara as family? The phone buzzed again before he could answer. Minjun this time, not Zara. A photo attached grainy, taken from distance. Zara at a coffee shop in Hongdae on her day off. Sitting across from a man Kangpai didn't recognize. European maybe. Mid-30s. Expensive watch. The kind of careful anonymity that screamed professional. They weren't touching. Barely seemed to be talking. But Zara's expression was different, harder, more focused. Not the warm, open woman who sang Afrikaans lullabies and clapped when Jihoon pointed at colors. This was someone else entirely. Minjun's text, meeting lasted 11 minutes. No physical exchange detected. Man's identity unknown. Facial recognition pending, Kangpai stared at the photo. At Zara's face that suddenly seemed like a mask he'd been too desperate to see through. At the man across from her who could be anyone, handler, contact, lover, threat. His phone buzzed with Zara's follow-up, please? He asked for you. Didn't speak obviously, but he pointed to your chair at the table. First time he's ever initiated wanting you there, Jihoon had asked for him. His silent, broken son had communicated a desire for his father's presence. And Kangpai was staring at evidence that the woman who'd made that miracle possible might be the very thing that would destroy them all. Chen's finger in a Tiffany box. Zara meeting unknown contacts. His son finally showing signs of healing. His enemies sensing vulnerability. All of it converging like a perfectly orchestrated disaster he should have seen coming. He'd survived 30 years by trusting no one. By assuming every kindness was manipulation and every smile hid a knife. But Zara had made Jihoon point to colors and eat vegetables and ask for his father at dinner. How did you calculate that cost-benefit analysis? Kangpai looked at the severed finger. Then at the photo of Zara. Then at her message about bibimbap and celebration. He should cancel dinner. Should have Minjun bring her in for questioning. Should remember that in his world, trust was the luxury that got you killed. Instead, he texted back, I'll be home by 7. And hated himself for not knowing if it was the bravest or stupidest thing he'd ever done. Zara was chopping vegetables when Kangpai came home with a gun pressed against her spine. She didn't scream. Didn't drop the knife. Just set it down carefully on the cutting board, next to the carrots she'd been julienning for Jihoon's bibimbap, and raised her hands slowly. Professional. Practiced. Exactly the way someone trained would respond. Where's Jihoon? She asked. Her voice was steady. The South African accent suddenly seemed thinner, like a coat she could shrug off when necessary. Upstairs with Minjun. Kangpai kept the Glock centered on her third vertebrae. Kill shot. Instant. Merciful, even. Playing with blocks. He won't hear anything. Good. She turned slowly, hands still raised, until she faced him. Those warm eyes that had made his son smile were completely calm. Resigned almost. You found the gaps. I found more than gaps. I found your real name. He watched her face for micro-expressions, tells, anything. Zara isn't even close, is it? A slight smile touched her lips. Sad. Real. Zara's my middle name. My mother was Afrikaans. That part was true. And the rest. Does it matter now? She glanced past him toward the stairs where his son was building towers, oblivious. Will you do it here, or take me somewhere Jihoon won't find the body? The clinical question should have confirmed everything. Should have made pulling the trigger easy. But Kangpai had spent 30 years reading people, and the woman in front of him wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of Jihoon being traumatized. Again. Who sent you? He kept his voice level. Chen? The Russians? Someone I haven't pissed off yet. No one sent me. Zara lowered her hands slightly, testing. When he didn't shoot, she lowered them completely. I came on my own. Took me 2 years to get the documents right. Another 6 months to get hired. You have very thorough background checks, by the way. Expensive to fool. Why? She walked to the kitchen table slowly, no sudden movements, and sat down like they were having tea instead of a confession. From her pocket, she pulled out a photograph. Placed it on the table between them. Kangpai looked. Nearly dropped the gun. Helen. His Helen, wearing scrubs, standing next to a younger woman with the same warm eyes. Both smiling at the camera like they had no idea death was coming for one of them. Helen Vanderberg, Zara said quietly. My half-sister. Same mother, different fathers. She didn't tell you because you were already paranoid about her safety. Thought one Canadian nurse was risky enough without adding complicated family dynamics. The photograph was real. Kangpai could tell he'd memorized every picture of Helen, and this one had the same smile, the same gentle expression she'd worn when she thought no one was watching. She wrote me letters, Zara continued. Every month for 3 years. Told me about you, about being pregnant, about how terrified she was of your world, but how much she loved you anyway. Told me if anything happened to her, to check on the baby. Make sure he was okay. The baby. Kangpai's voice sounded foreign to his own ears. Not me. She knew you could take care of yourself. Zara met his eyes without flinching. Jihoon was the one who'd be vulnerable. The one who'd need someone who understood what it meant to love a child born into violence. So this was what? Keeping a promise to a dead woman. This was keeping a promise to my sister. Her voice broke slightly. First real crack in her composure. I couldn't save her. I was in Cape Town when she called, bleeding out in Seoul, and I couldn't do anything except listen to her die over a phone line. She made me promise, her last words, to make sure her son knew he was loved. That he had family. Kangpai wanted to call it manipulation. Wanted to see the angles, the play, the endgame. But he'd heard that same phone call. Had listened to Helen's final moments on repeat until Minjun had destroyed the recording to preserve his sanity. If Zara was lying, she was better than anyone he'd ever encountered. If she was telling the truth. The man in Hongdae, he said. Who is he? My handler from South African intelligence. I was a field operative before I became a nanny. He wanted to make sure I hadn't gone rogue, falling for a crime lord while trying to raise his kid. She smiled without humor. I told him I had everything under control. Do you? Zara looked at him. Really looked, past the gun, past the threat, straight into whatever was left of his soul. I came here to honor my sister. To make sure her son survived. But somewhere between teaching him colors and watching you try so hard to be a father despite having no idea how, no. I don't have anything under control. From upstairs, they could hear Jihoon's small footsteps. Minjun's low voice asking if he wanted juice. The domestic soundtrack of a life Kangpai had thought was healing. I should kill you, he said. Probably. Zara stood, walked past the gun like it didn't exist, and went back to chopping vegetables. But then who's going to finish the bibimbap? Jihoon specifically requested extra egg, and you'll mess up the proportions. The absolute audacity of it, turning her back on him, returning to meal prep like they hadn't just shattered every illusion, should have been infuriating. Instead, Kangpai lowered the gun. Helen never mentioned a sister. She was protecting me. Same way she tried to protect you by not telling you she was scared. Zara's knife moved in precise, practiced strokes. We're all very good at protecting people by lying to them. Doesn't make it right. Just makes it familiar. Kangpai stood there, gun heavy in his hand, watching his dead wife's secret half-sister make dinner for the son she'd infiltrated his life to save. This doesn't mean I trust you, he said finally. Good. Zara didn't look up. Trust gets people killed in your world. I'm not here for trust. I'm here for Jihoon. And me? She paused. Met his eyes over her shoulder with an expression that held too much truth. You were supposed to be collateral damage. Target's father. Necessary obstacle. Someone I'd work around to reach the child. Was. She turned back to the vegetables. Dinner's at 7. Don't be late. Your son asked for you. Kangpai left the kitchen. Put the gun in his study safe. Stood at the window overlooking Seoul while his world rearranged itself into patterns he didn't recognize. Helen had a sister. That sister was a trained operative. That operative had spent 6 months infiltrating his household with forged documents and strategic competence. And somehow, impossibly, that same woman had made his broken son laugh. Downstairs, Zara started humming that Afrikaans lullaby. The one Helen used to sing. The one they'd both learned from the same mother. Kangpai closed his eyes and tried to remember when his life had become something other than controlled violence and calculated distance. Tried to remember when he'd started hoping for more. Tried to remember why that hope felt more dangerous than any gun pointed at his head. The attack came on a Thursday during Ji-hoon's music therapy session. Kangpai was in Hong Kong negotiating a truce with the triads when Minjun's call came through. 3 words that stopped his heart. They have them. Not Ji-hoon. Not Zara. Them. Both. Together. Chen's people had breached the house during the shift change. The 30-second window Kangpai had been meaning to eliminate for 6 months, but never prioritized because he'd been distracted by bibimbap and lullabies and the dangerous fantasy that love could exist without consequences in his world. Arrogance. Fatal, unforgivable arrogance. Demands. His voice was ice. Around him, the Hong Kong triads watched with predatory interest. Weakness was currency here. Blood in the water. They want Busan. Full territorial concession. The ports, the networks, everything. Minjun's voice cracked slightly. And they want you to deliver it personally. Alone. They'll provide coordinates. A trap. Obviously a trap. They'd kill him, take Busan anyway, and leave Ji-hoon orphaned with a nanny who'd already proven she could disappear when convenient. Except Zara wouldn't disappear. That was the problem. She'd promised a dead woman she'd protect that child, and Kangpai had spent 6 months watching her keep impossible promises. She'd fight. She'd die fighting. And Ji-hoon would watch another person he loved bleed out because of proximity to Kangpai. Assemble the response team, Kangpai said. Full tactical. I want. His phone buzzed. A video message from an unknown number. He opened it with hands that had stopped shaking during his first kill at 19 but trembled now. The footage was grainy, shot on someone's cell phone. Ji-hoon sat in what looked like a warehouse, Zara's body wrapped around him like a shield. Her face was already bruising. She'd fought, of course she'd fought, but her hands were gentle on Ji-hoon's head, covering his ears, whispering something Kangpai couldn't hear. The camera panned to show 4 armed men. Then back to Zara. One of Chen's lieutenants stepped into frame, gun visible. He said something in Mandarin. Zara's jaw tightened, but she didn't move. Didn't unwrap herself from Ji-hoon's small body. The lieutenant raised the gun. Pressed it against her temple. Ji-hoon's eyes, those dark eyes that had been empty for 5 years, went wide with terror. His small hands clutched Zara's shirt. His mouth opened. No. The word was barely audible on the video. Small. Broken. Perfect. No, please. Don't hurt her. Ji-hoon's first words. Spoken not in joy or discovery, but in the same terror that had silenced him in the womb. Kangpai watched his son find his voice to beg for Zara's life, and something in his chest cracked so completely he thought he might be dying. The video ended. A text followed. Asterisk Busan. 2 hours. Come alone or we start with her fingers. Asterisk. Kangpai looked at the Hong Kong triads. At Minjun's face on the phone screen, waiting for orders. At the empire he'd built with blood and calculation and ruthless pragmatism. Then he looked at the frozen frame of his son clutching the woman who'd infiltrated their lives with lies and love in equal measure. There was a right choice here. A smart choice. Mobilize his forces, mount a tactical rescue, minimize casualties, maintain territorial control. Sacrifice 2 people to save an empire. Cold calculus. Survival mathematics. Everything his father had trained him to do. But Ji-hoon had spoken. After 5 years of silence, his son had found words to beg for someone's life. If Kangpai let Zara die, those might be the last words Ji-hoon ever spoke. Cancel the tactical team, he said quietly. Minjun's face went white. Sir. I'm going alone. Prepare the Busan concession documents. Full transfer, legally binding, everything they want. They'll kill you anyway. You know they'll. I know. Kangpai ended the call. Looked at the triads watching him with barely concealed satisfaction. Gentlemen, we'll have to postpone. Family emergency. He was on his private jet 20 minutes later, flying toward Seoul with a gun he wouldn't be able to use and documents that would destroy everything he'd built. The rational part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive for 30 years, was screaming. This was suicide. Strategic disaster. Emotional compromise that would get him killed and accomplish nothing. But he kept seeing Ji-hoon's face. Kept hearing that small, terrified, "No, please." Kept thinking about Helen bleeding out while he was an ocean away, choosing business over presence. Making the smart choice. The safe choice. The choice that left his son born into blood and silence. Not again. He couldn't make that choice again. The jet landed in Seoul. Minjun was waiting with a car, his expression carved from stone. "The coordinates lead to the old shipping district," he said. "Abandoned since the port expansion. No cover, no backup options. If you go in there, I'm already dead." "I know." Kangpai checked his gun more from habit than hope. "Make sure Ji-hoon is taken care of. The offshore accounts, the legitimate holdings, it's all documented. He'll be wealthy enough to disappear if he wants." And Zara. Kangpai thought about Helen's sister, who'd forged documents and infiltrated his life, and taught his son that the world could include things other than silence and control. Who'd probably known from the start this would end in blood. If she survives, she gets the choice. Stay or go. No obligations. He met Minjun's eyes. She kept her promise to Helen. That counts for something. The warehouse was exactly as expected. Isolated. Defensible. Perfect for an execution dressed as an exchange. Kangpai walked in alone, hands visible, Busan documents in a briefcase that felt absurdly civilized under the circumstances. Chen's lieutenant stood in the center. Around him, 20 armed men. Professional positions. Overlapping fields of fire. No chance of survival even if Kangpai had brought an army. And in the corner, Zara still wrapped around Ji-hoon, both of them alive, but her face showing the mathematics of what staying alive had cost. Ji-hoon saw him. Those dark eyes went even wider. His mouth opened again, shaping words that 5 years of therapy couldn't produce, but terror had unlocked. "Appa. Father. Appa, run." Kangpai had faced death 16 times before. Had walked into ambushes and traps and impossible situations with nothing but calculation and cold pragmatism to keep him alive. But he'd never had his son beg him to run. "I'm not running," he said softly in Korean. Then to Chen's lieutenant in Mandarin, "I have your documents. Busan is yours. Let them go." The lieutenant smiled. "Of course. We're honorable businessmen." The lie was obvious. Insultingly obvious. They'd take Busan and kill everyone in this room because leaving witnesses was sloppy and Chen's organization didn't do sloppy. Kangpai had known this from the start. Had walked in anyway because some choices weren't about survival. They were about what you could live with if you somehow did survive. He set down the briefcase. Looked at Zara, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't decipher. Looked at Ji-hoon, whose small voice was still whispering "Appa, Appa," like a prayer or a curse. "I'm sorry," Kangpai said. To both of them. For everything. For being the kind of man whose love was fatal. For thinking he could have this and keep them safe. For choosing them anyway, even knowing how it would end. Chen's lieutenant raised his gun. And the warehouse exploded. The explosion wasn't Kangpai's plan. It was Zara's. Later, much later, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and regret, she'd explain how she'd palmed a GPS tracker during the abduction. How her South African intelligence handler had triangulated their position and called in a favor with the American DEA, who'd been salivating over Chen's organization for 18 months. How she'd counted seconds and calculated blast radius and made the choice to risk Ji-hoon's life on her training instead of watching Kangpai die trying to save them. But in the moment, there was only fire and chaos and Kangpai's body moving on instinct, covering the space between him and his family before conscious thought could catch up. He reached them as the second charge detonated. Wrapped himself around both of them, Zara and Ji-hoon, this broken constellation he'd somehow claimed, and felt something punch through his shoulder. Bullet or shrapnel, didn't matter. Just pain and wetness and the small sound Ji-hoon made against his chest. Not silence. A sob. His son was crying, making noise, being loud and messy and alive. "I've got you," Kangpai said into Ji-hoon's hair. "Appa's got you." The warehouse became a firefight. DEA agents pouring in through breaches, Chen's men returning fire, everything dissolving into the kind of violence Kangpai had spent 30 years orchestrating, but never expected to survive as collateral damage. Zara was moving, dragging both of them toward cover with the efficient brutality of someone who'd done this before. Her face was bleeding. Her arm hung wrong. But she didn't stop until they were behind a concrete pillar, relatively safe from the crossfire turning the warehouse into hell. "You came," she said, blood on her teeth, disbelief in her eyes. "You actually came alone. You idiot. You beautiful, stupid idiot. You called the DEA," Kangpai managed. His shoulder was screaming. "You burned my entire operation. I saved your life." "Same thing." She laughed. Actually laughed, this broken, beautiful sound that had no business existing in a place where people were dying. "Helen said you'd choose wrong when it mattered. Said you'd pick love over survival every single time, and it would either be your salvation or your execution. Which one is this?" Zara looked at Ji-hoon, still sobbing against Kangpai's chest, his small voice forming words through tears. "Please don't die. Please don't die. Please don't die." "Both," she whispered. The aftermath took 6 months to settle. Chen's organization collapsed under DEA pressure. Kangpai's empire crumbled with it, assets seized, lieutenants arrested, decades of careful construction dismantled by federal agents who'd been gifted enough evidence to end organized crime in 3 countries. Kangpai spent 4 of those months in prison awaiting trial. His lawyers, expensive, ruthless, exactly as competent as blood money could buy, negotiated a deal: full cooperation, complete testimony, witness protection in exchange for reduced sentencing. The ghost of Gangnam would disappear. Not through death, but through something worse. Irrelevance. Minjun visited once. Didn't sit down. Just stood across the bulletproof glass with an expression that held 30 years of loyalty and absolute contempt. "You destroyed everything," he said flatly. "For a woman and a child. Everything your father built. Everything we bled for. I know. Was it worth it?" Kangpai thought about Ji-hoon's voice, emerging from 5 years of silence to beg for the people he loved. Thought about Zara's hand in his during the ambulance ride, her grip fierce despite her broken arm. Thought about the choice between empire and family, between survival and salvation. "Ask me in 20 years," he said. Minjun left without another word. Kangpai never saw him again. The Witness Protection Program relocated them to Vancouver, Helen City. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They lived in a modest house in a modest neighborhood where Kangpai was now David Park, software consultant, and Zara was his wife of 7 years. The lies were easier this time. Built on something real. Ji-hoon started school as James Park. He spoke, halting at first, then gradually more, his voice finding strength in an environment where silence wasn't survival. He made friends. Brought home terrible report cards in art and excellent ones in math. Became aggressively normal in the way only children who've survived abnormal childhoods can manage. Some nights, he still had nightmares. Would wake up screaming for his appa, for Zara, for the mother he'd never known but whose pictures covered his bedroom wall. Kangpai would hold him. Zara would sing that Afrikaans lullaby. Together, they'd piece their son back into something resembling whole. "Do you miss it?" Zara asked one night, 3 years into their new life. They were washing dishes, actual domestic normalcy, while Ji-hoon did homework at the kitchen table. The power. The empire. Being someone who mattered. Kangpai looked at his son, struggling through fractions with the determined focus he'd once used on block towers. Looked at Zara, her face free of bruises, her smile genuine and unafraid. "I was never someone who mattered," he said quietly. "I was someone who scared people. There's a difference." And now? Now he drove Ji-hoon to soccer practice. Now he helped with homework and attended parent-teacher conferences, and lived in a world where the most dangerous thing he did was merge onto the highway during rush hour. Now he was nobody. David Park. Software consultant. Mediocre cook. Decent father, getting better. "Now I matter to 2 people," Kangpai said. "Turns out that's enough." Zara kissed him. soft and brief and tasting like dish soap, and the kind of future King Pai had stopped believing in somewhere between his first kill and his last empire. At the table, Ji-hoon looked up from his fractions. Appa? Can you help me? I don't understand this problem. The boy's voice was clear, strong, unafraid to ask for help. King Pai crossed the kitchen to sit beside his son. Started explaining fractions with the same patience he'd once used to plan territorial expansions. Felt Zara's hand on his shoulder, grounding him to this small, impossible life they'd built from the ruins of everything he used to be. Outside, Vancouver rain fell soft against the windows. Inside, a family that shouldn't exist, built on lies and blood and love in equal measure, survived another ordinary evening. The ghost of Gangnam was dead. Long live David Park, who'd traded 3 continents for 3 people and somehow, impossibly, won. Love, loss, and second chances, sometimes the strongest empires are the ones we build at home. Asterisk, what would you sacrifice for family? Have you ever had to choose between who you were and who you wanted to become? Share your story in the comments below. And if this journey moved you, subscribe for more tales of redemption, romance, and the messy beauty of starting over. Your story matters. Tell it, *Blueheart. Subscribe, like, comment, share your experience.